Well, there's multiple problems with state school aid with respect to Rockland County. We pay the second highest property taxes in America, and we have been continually shortchanged, starting with the labor coefficient. Rockland County schools are treated like upstate New York schools as opposed to Long Island and New York City. So I would change the labor coefficient to be reflective of what our labor costs actually are here and make sure that we are being compensated with the millions of dollars of state aid that we're entitled to. I think beyond that, in this year's budget, my opponent voted to cut school aid to Suffern, Pearl River, and South Orangetown school districts. And it's wrong. I would never vote for a budget that cuts direct state aid to Rockland County schools. So I think what we really need is somebody who's going to go up there and fight to fix the broken state school aid formula. My opponent has failed miserably over the last 14 years in doing that. And with respect to the East Ramapo School District, which obviously has been severely shortchanged, part of the problem is that my opponent has been unwilling to address at a state level the federally mandated services that private school students are entitled to. And so it comes out of the local public school budget. It needs to be taken care of at the state level. And the state should be funding private school, federally mandated services of busing, books, special education, and get it out of our public school budget so that our public school students are not being shortchanged. So I would start with the $100 million taxpayer finance, campaign finance system that my opponent voted for, which is taking $100 million out of our taxes to pay for welfare for politicians. I'd eliminate that program immediately. Beyond that, when you start looking at some of the decisions that are being made, you know, we pay for things like congestion pricing now that my opponent voted for, which is basically a tax on suburban residents. We get shortchanged every year when it comes to MTA services. We pay $40 million more in taxes to the MTA than services received, and then my opponent adds on top of it the congestion pricing. So I would start looking at how we make New York more affordable, how we prioritize a $177 billion budget. Okay, when you look at that, there's absolutely no doubt that there is excessive spending. For instance, my opponent voted to cut state school aid while voting to create a $27 million free college tuition plan for illegal immigrants. It's wrong. It's wrong. We need to prioritize spending. We pay the second highest taxes in America right here in Rockland County. And so what I want to do is make Rockland more affordable. I want to focus on how we prioritize our Medicaid program. We spend 49% more in Medicaid services than the average of the other 49 states. And New York is the only state left that forces the counties to pay a quarter of the cost of Medicaid. We obviously have an expansive program. We need to make sure that we're taking care of those who need services, but we also need to make sure that we are looking at how we find savings within every layer of government, especially at a time when New York State, they entered the year with a $6 billion deficit. They're going to end the year with a far greater deficit due to COVID in large part, but it's really due in major part due to the mismanagement by the governor and the state legislature, all of which it's one-party rule in Albany. We need to restore common sense and balance. That's what I'm putting forth, and I will work with my colleagues in Albany to find savings and to make Rockland County and New York State more affordable. Look, I think another shutdown would be detrimental to our economy. It would be detrimental to all the small businesses who have struggled to survive, many of which have had to close down permanently. It would be disastrous for working parents who are trying to balance both their children learning in a hybrid situation and still working. So I think another shutdown would be absolutely detrimental to our economy and to our community. I think if the cases spike to a point where we're dealing with a huge increase in hospitalizations or mortality rate, then obviously we need to take every measure necessary to prevent that, which potentially could include another shutdown. But I think as a government, we need to be working with communities across the county, across the state, to make sure that people are wearing their masks, to make sure that people are adhering to social distancing guidelines, and to make sure that we are doing everything we can to avoid a rapid spike. Yes, I would repeal the disastrous cashless bail law that my opponent, Ellen Jaffee, co-sponsored. The bottom line is it was a disastrous piece of legislation that she put forth without talking to law enforcement, district attorneys, judges, and did not include judicial discretion. New Jersey did cashless bail as well, but they included judicial discretion. Judges need to be able to determine whether or not somebody deserves bail based on the merits of their case, their individual conduct, and whether or not they have a history of offenses. And so when you look at what has gone on in New York City and the rapid rise in crime, it is directly attributable to cashless bail, shutting down Rikers Island, defunding the police by over $1 billion, eliminating the anti-crime unit, and a number of other disastrous decisions. So I want to work with law enforcement, work with judges, work with community advocates to pass sensible legislation that includes judicial discretion, ensures fairness and equality within the justice system, but also ensures public safety. That is the #1 priority of government, and that is our responsibility. And I take it very seriously, and it's a shame that my opponent would pass such a piece of legislation without working with law enforcement. Well, of course, you look at what's going on, and it's a very difficult situation financially, not just for the state, but all of our local municipalities, our nonprofit agencies that partner with government to provide necessary and essential services. And so it comes back to the issue of prioritizing state spending. When you take a 20% across the board cut, you're not being logical, you're not using common sense to make sure that we're prioritizing our spending. So again, I would eliminate things like a $100 million taxpayer campaign finance system, which we don't need. We don't need welfare for politicians when our schools, when our nonprofits need help. They need support. So it very much requires utilizing common sense and a balanced approach. I went to school for accounting and finance. I'll use those skills and that background to make sure that we are prioritizing our spending and that we are helping those nonprofits. I've been amazed. I had COVID early on back in March, and after I got out of my quarantine, I went about meeting up with our nonprofit leaders, sitting down with them, talking about their issues, their concerns, how I can be helpful both as Deputy Town Supervisor in Orangetown, but also, should I win election, how I can help them from a state level. And they do amazing work. And I've been very impressed by how they have, picked up their bootstraps and done everything they need to do to assist those struggling during this pandemic. And so I want to make sure that our nonprofits have the resources they need. Frankly, prior to COVID, they weren't getting many of the resources they needed to begin with. A lot of them had to do fundraising, separate and apart from any aid or grants that they receive. So I want to work with them closely to make sure that they have the resources they need, and also our municipalities, who are really going to be cash strapped as we move forward because of some of the unfunded mandates that my opponent and the governor have pushed on them, including an increase in pension costs this year, where they have increased the pension contribution for municipalities to help balance their own budget. So there's a lot that needs to be done from a state level to make Rockland more affordable, make New York State more affordable, and make sure that we're working with our nonprofit partners.
Well, that is a very serious issue. The low and middle class New Yorkers, they, certainly pay more than their share of taxes. And to somehow to end this disparity, New York should join our neighbor, New Jersey, and pass the millionaires tax. We have the votes in both houses. It's time New York's wealthiest, actually provides the proportionate income tax, to pay at a proportionate tax, to be able to assure that the middle class and those at the low income are given this opportunity. At the same time, we have to continue. Actually, what I was talking about was strengthening the programs like STAR and Enhanced STAR, to keep costs low for middle class homeowners and our seniors, as I noted before. This starts by removing changes to STAR program that confuse middle class and senior taxpayers, making it harder for them to pay school taxes. Additionally, we truly have to adjust the foundation aid formula to do more than just make sure Rockland is treated like all upstate neighbors. So that's an area that we have to really focus on. It is an issue. And it's something that certainly we need to have much more of an in-depth conversation in terms of how it will be truly impacting us. It's not something that we have to just let it move on. We have to have a conversation. It's something that I've mentioned to a couple of my colleagues, and we have to see if we can really talk about what the impact is, what we really need to do moving forward with this. So that is a major issue that we have to consider. I am concerned about how, how it is structured and how that will impact us in the long run. Two-tiered wealth-based system, which is really always been a conversation and always been a concern, under which people who, could afford bail got out, and people who couldn't wound up in jail for length of time, undermining their families, and without them even being convicted, they get caught up in that. And it's known that the wealth or lack thereof, of wealth, does not measure who is more willing to commit a crime. I will not support one system has a double standard. At the same time, crime is based on the wealth, and it's really a problem. We discussed it during our budget discussions, and we did, adjust the new bail laws clearly to be able to include, the more violent crimes to lists that were not applicable to the new bail reforms, and so we added that. But some of the changes included more crimes that are associated with domestic violence. That was something that was essential, that somehow it was just outrageous that was not included within that context. So this way, while we are ensuring that the nonviolent offenders are not jailed before being found guilty by the courts, a constitutional right, we have to control that bail system so that it responds in a much more effective way, and assuring that those that do have that issue, it's not something that we should just accept from the legislators, nor should we continue to, a cycle of mass incarceration that punishes people, and who, and very often, and all too often, it is very clear that those that are put in jail for too long a period of time before they're even committed are people of color, Black or brown backgrounds, for their economic status rather than their crime that they committed as well. So those are issues that need to be responded. We have to look at reforms in a race-blind manner. There's no question about that. Institutional racism, not actual guilt. That has played, unfortunately, a great role in determining guilt, and the length of the sentences, and who can pay to get out of jail versus who cannot. And those are very real issues of concern. And so those are things that we need to continue to focus. It is a major issue. And, we need much more federal funding. We truly need to focus much more on the federal funding issues. The federal government has, failure. They have failed to adequately address the COVID-19 pandemic, and it's caused so much in state funding, and the state deficit will continue to balloon. It ballooned to about $13.3 billion. Those Republicans in Washington were pushing through a bailout that favored corporations and the wealthy over the middle class. So, it is important now for us to be responsive in that way, assuring that we, are cautious about how that kind of funding is provided. Well, I'm very optimistic, and I can't wait to be able to continue the work, especially given the circumstances, the issues that we have to approach for families, for our children. I've been focusing on that. I'm a former educator, how essential it is that we invest in childcare and our education systems. And that is something that is inspiring and that gives me to continue to give me the opportunity to focus on the issues in educating our youth and the actually to assure that our families have the kind of support to be able to assure that they have stability. And that really is what our future is about. And preparing our youth for the future, preparing them with the, even when they're in childcare, giving them that kind of stability. A family can work and a family can have that kind of stability, but their children are then in a childcare program or an early education. They then are being prepared socially and even focused on academics. And it gives them an ability to move forward in the future in a positive way if our districts are also providing smaller size classes and appropriate education. Well, as I was talking about with education and childcare, and we talked about the criminal justice reform, there are so many extraordinary issues, our colleges, our community colleges, and how we focus on the criminal justice system as well, and really investing in our youth, working together. We need to work together to assure that we are providing all of our communities at every level of income support and opportunity to have stability, to invest in their future, because it invests in our future in the state and in this country. And I'll tell you, as a former teacher in East Ramapo, I can tell you, when children had homes where there was stability, they were able to then also have much more stability and did well in school. So in reality, to work with everyone and continue fighting for everyone in Rockland, fighting for their support and focusing on the work that we need to do for everyone, all of our community, every part of our community. I represent probably one of the most diverse districts in the state, and it is inspiring. And it also, I learn about all the issues at every level of what kinds of things we need to do for our families, for our youth, for the future. And that is what is so essential and inspiring when I can make a difference, when I work with my colleagues and we work together.